Okay. So Friedrich Engels says, I believe it's in Ludwig Feuerbach in the End of German Philosophy, that that there are two components to Hegel. There's the system and the method. The right Hegelians go for the system, right? Like, can we complete the system of deriving all the concept, of kind of deriving all the kind of abstract concepts of human knowledge in a systematized way. Whereas the left Hegelians go for the method of dialectics. And so what dialectics is, to take a step back, if we look at, you find dialectics in all kinds of philosophy. Engels says somewhere that, just as people spoke prose before they knew what prose was, people thought dialectically before knowing what dialectics were. And what if we were to give a kind of traditional philosophy account, taking into account that, this is a one-sided and European version of the story, one could say that Zeno of Elea is the father of dialectics. And what he did was he was a follower of Parmenides, the ancient Eleatic philosopher, who pre-Socratic, who believed that everything was one thing, that there is no motion, there is no change, but we're all just kind of deluded into thinking we're different from each other and that things are moving when it's all just one. And Parmenides would present arguments for this position. What Zeno of Elea did was he would present arguments to show that the opposite couldn't be true. So he would say, okay, you believe in motion. Well, if motion is possible, then things must be in two places at once. And that's a contradiction. So motion can't be possible. Oh, if you fire an arrow, there's an infinite number of, you can say divide the distance infinitely. And so it can never traverse an infinite distance. So the arrow clearly can't move. And so what he ends up doing is inventing this style of argument where he takes the opposite position and shows that it leads to an absurd conclusion. What Hegelian dialectics does is it takes this moment, or this tool that we use primarily either to argue against people for polemics, or by skeptics to say that we can't have knowledge because there's fundamentally contradictions or antinomies that we can't get beyond. He turns this into a positive engine of thinking. For Hegel, dialectics is about taking one-sided concepts and showing how, when we analyze them, they turn into their opposites. And taking one-sided positions and showing how they end up becoming the opposite of what they seem to claim to be. And one way to kind of introduce this method would be to start with this essay that I mentioned that Hegel wrote for a popular audience. It's called Who Thinks Abstractly? And I teach this to my students to start off. So Hegel gives this example of a murderer being led to be executed. And, hopefully Luigi is not in this situation, right? But like Luigi, this murderer is really good looking, right? And some ladies are standing by and they see the murderer and they're like, ooh, it's a good looking dude. And everyone's standing around, they're saying, how can you say that? Don't you know he's a murderer? And Hegel says those people who say that are thinking abstractly, because to them, the idea that a person could be both a murderer and beautiful is somehow impossible, because somebody who is a murderer is completely a murderer. And then he says, similarly, if someone were to try to do a psychoanalysis of this murderer and to say, oh, here's why he became a murderer. He had a really abusive family. Then the person's like, oh, so you're trying to excuse this person now. And Hegel says that's also thinking abstractly, because for them, the murderer is an abstraction of a murderer. But the real murderer is all of the things that brought the murderer to that point, including all of the contradictions, right? So the murderer maybe helped his neighbor with, the elderly lady down the street or whatever with her groceries, right? That doesn't seem diabolical or what we imagine murderer to be. But real murderers are precisely contradictory, right? Real murderers are not just purely murderers or purely nice people. That everything has a lot more going on to it. And so to understand things concretely is to not just look in these pure ideal concepts where everything is just one thing or is essentialized in a certain way, but to recognize that everything is full of tension, full of contradiction, full of opposing and antithetical elements. And so what Hegel does in the phenomenology of spirit is, and the logic for that matter, is he uses a dialectical method that can be described as having 3 stages. Now, you may have heard it sometimes described in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And I think most people know, because of like the internet memes and stuff, that Hegel never used these terms and they don't really work. They come from the British idealists. And the only time he's ever uses the phrase is he mentions some followers of Kant who think everything is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So like the only time he uses it is in reference to someone else. And so, but there are 3 moments in Hegel. And you could think of the first one as the abstract moment. The moment that takes something and isolates it and thinks about it in universal terms. He compares the moment of abstraction to like Plato, when Plato says, you know, like there are many beautiful things, but what is beauty itself, right? And when you look at, like, there is something that's important about abstraction, because when Hegel talks about his experiences teaching in the Nuremberg Gymnasium, he says, like in letters, that he's like, it's so hard to teach these children how to abstract, right? They only see individual things. They don't see the concept behind it all. And I've noticed this too, like in philosophy, like I usually start, you know, early in my intro classes with Plato, because it's important to teach people to think like, okay, there's a difference between like good things and the concept of good. There's a difference between what's right and wrong and what makes something right and wrong, right? And so abstraction is important, but it's very limited. And then Hegel would say it's not even true. It's not the true picture of things. It's an incomplete picture, and therefore a false one if we take it to be the final say of things. Abstraction is important for Marx too, right? So the first move in Capital is to say what the wealth of nations in the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of commodities. And he says that we take the commodity, he says it's like the microscope zooms in on the cell. We're zooming in on, using the power of abstraction, on the cell of capitalism, the commodity. And this too is a very Hegelian move, because for Hegel, the way that the system unfolds is starting with the most basic and simple elements and moving forward to the most complex or highest, most encompassing. And so that also means that in a Hegelian manner of presentation, there often is like symmetry with history, but it's not historical in the mode of genesis. It's an ahistorical genesis. The phenomenology of spirit starts with something that one might associate with Parmenides and maybe ancient Hindu thought on the one hand, but then it, like, Christianity is like after the French Revolution somehow. Wait, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, or like Antigone is you know, after Newtonian science, and that's because it's a logical way of historical development, much like in Capital, right? So Capital begins with the commodity and the simple forms and how they build up, and then it ends with primitive accumulation, something that is not historically before all of the working class laws of the 1830s, right? And so that's that kind of mode of building things up from their simplest to their highest points in a way that mirrors what seems like a historical or kind of like evolutionary development, but is not in fact history as it unfolds in time. So then we start with abstraction. What happens next? Well, the idea for Hegel is that when we analyze the content of these abstractions, we find that they each contradict themselves and turn into their opposites. So an example for this would be something like the idea of the different. And this is a paradox that has a very Platonic ring to it. Well, we'd say, is the different, if we think of the different as a Platonic form, we might ask, well, if it's a Platonic form, doesn't that make it the same as itself, right? And like eternal and the same and unchanging? Well, now it's not very different, is it, right? So then the different is different from itself, right? You know, and there's that kind of like turning things upside down. Similarly with being, we ask, what is being? Well, being is not something that is. Everything that is has being, but being itself is not a being, right? And so there's a sense in which being is empty. Being has no content. Pure thatness is not a whatness. So being turns into nothing. It's opposite. Then we ask, what is nothing? Well, we just said, what is nothing? And so now nothing has turned into its opposite as well, being, right? Because if you imagine like, well, what was there before, you know, if you think about the Christian idea of like creation out of nothing, well, what was there before anything? And you say, well, there was nothing. And then, well, so there is nothing, right? You know, so nothing has being in a certain way. And what's cool about this is that Hegel subjects all of the categories of metaphysics, all the categories of philosophy, being, nothing, becoming, cause, effect, freedom, necessity, to this kind of dialectical critique, where instead of thinking about them in a one-sided way, where we just see, this is a cause, this is an effect. We have the cause, then it creates the effect. That then causes another effect and another effect and another effect, right? That'd be a very one-sided way. We see how causes and effects co-determine each other. So for example, one analogy Hegel uses at times is like a parent is the cause of their child, but a parent only becomes a parent through their child. So the child is just as much a cause of the parent, right? So there's a reciprocal causality. And that's where you kind of like turn into this kind of topsy-turvy, contradictory way of thinking that dialectics enables. Then if you think about, here's an example that might help too. So one of the like the arguments for the existence of God is the first cause argument. And you say, okay, so every cause or every effect has a cause. That cause has to be the effect of some other cause. Things can't be both a cause and effect, so we go into this infinite regress until we get to some first cause. Well, the first cause is actually a violation of the very rule we've set up, because the first cause is the cause of itself, so it's a self-affected being, right? A self-caused cause is a contradiction. It's literally the thing that we weren't supposed to do that led us on this whole series. And Hegel, in a certain way, wants to think everything in the structure of a self-caused cause or a self-moving concept. And then you get to Capital by Marx. And what is capital? It's self-valorizing, right? It's like God creating himself, right? Like capital creates the conditions for its own realization. It's self-valorizing. It is that it has this structure of infinity to it. And Hegel is really about finding this structure of infinity. And so I went on a huge tangent here. So from the moment of abstraction, we get to the second moment, which is the dialectical or negatively rational moment. And that's where the abstraction turns into its opposite and contradicts itself. And normally skepticism would take this to be the proof that whatever we're analyzing is false. But in Hegelian dialectics, there's a third moment called the speculative moment, which recognizes that contradiction that we found is actually the truth of the thing. That to really understand it, we need to understand how the point of tension within a category where it turns into its opposite and unifies with it. This is what Engels calls the unity of opposites, right? And so if you look at something like nature, the dialectical view of time is that each now is a now that negates itself to turn into another now. That time is like both is and is not. If you look at the dialectical idea of motion, things are in two places at once. They like move kind of like a cartoon where they're like, you know, between two places, because for something to really move, it can't be at one place and then another place and then another place, but it has to be between the two places. Boundaries are really interesting too as a dialectical thing, because like where is a boundary, right? Is the French-German border in France or in Germany? Well, in a weird way, you have to think how the border from the French side it's in Germany, and from the German side it's in France. But it's like what is in France is its termination and all this stuff. And so what you get from dialectics is this way to think about relations and interaction in a way that takes every aspect of this into account. You see it from every possible perspective and how everything determines everything else. And in the science of logic, Hegel does this with the pure thought. So I'm just going to think the concept of being, and I'm going to think about it until I find the inner contradiction in it. And that's going to produce its opposite, nothing. I'm going to think nothing. It's going to produce its opposite, being. And then the higher concept is going to be realizing that there's a movement between being and nothing, which is then becoming the higher concept, because what becoming is change, transition. And so then we have two sides of that correspond to the previous sides. Being become, we have coming into being and leaving being, which is like, something that's entering being, neither all the way is nor isn't. Or something that's the moment that something ceases to be, it's not fully gone, but it's not still here either. It's like between the two.
Is that where we get the term like sublation, so to speak? Is that where that term comes in? Is that the becoming, so to speak?
Yeah, so I can talk about sublation. So sublation is a German word Aufhebung, which Hegel really likes, because it means so like one way you'd use it in German is like if you were to cut both sides off of a math equation or something, and like cancel out the sides, so it has that sense of canceling, but it also has this sense of like you're taking something away to preserve it, and then also the sense of like lifting up. And so Hegel likes the word sublation or Aufhebung for describing negations that negate something, but the fact that something has been negated still matters. There's a Zizek joke about this that I think comes from a film that's quite good for illustrating this, which is the Sartre walks into the bar and asks for the coffee without milk. They say, we're out of milk. Would you like it without cream instead? And so sublation is a negation. A sublation is like a negation that is determined by what it negates, and that preserves in negating something the very thing that it negates. So an example would be like an illusion. Well, what the something that illusions are and are not, right? They are illusions, but they are not what they appear to be. And so when Hegel starts in the Doctrine of Essence with the concept of shine, of illusionary being, or if we think about like a Cartesian who starts with like, well, I can't be sure if anything's real, but I can be sure I'm at least experiencing it. You're like, what is certain is that I'm, something seems to be. That what you're taking there is a sublated form of existence. What you're taking there as your starting point is something's being canceled out. You could also think about the whole like idea of like negativity is really interesting here too. Like if you think about like two forces like pressing on each other and there's no motion because both forces have canceled each other out, that's another way you could think about sublation. But yeah, the idea would be that sublation is when when being becomes nothing and nothing becomes being. We don't just go like some broken robot to like being then nothing, nothing then being then nothing, nothing then being, but that we go from being to nothing, and then we recognize that as, okay, when something goes from being to nothing, that's ceasing to be. When something goes from nothing to being, that's coming to be. And so coming to be is something that's determined by what is being pushed away. Same with ceasing to be, if that makes sense. So I would say that that's what sublation is. So in the Marxist context, when people talk about, controversially sometimes about, that socialism or communism is the sublation of capitalism. And the idea there is that it's not just like, okay, so then there's capitalism, it stops. Now we have socialism that has just replaced it, like a, jumping from time 1 to point 2 with no space in between, no transition. But it's the idea that one has to take the forces as they are currently and transform them into something different, right? Not just like, all right, let's just discard the past and start something new from scratch, right? And that's, yeah, you can think about that too from this whole idea of the dialectic as generating things out of their opposites, right? And moving from a higher stage. And so, and then you see that too in like, it gets really weird in like nature and history and stuff like that, especially history, as we'll talk about. But right? So like Hegel actually wants to start with time and then derive, or start with space and then derive time as like a more complex version of space. And then, you know, motion is like this complex, like unity of the two opposites. It gets very abstract and very interesting too at the same time. But I think that what it enables you to do is to think about things like if we're thinking about ourselves and like, you know, there are certain deterministic elements in history, but we're also agents, right? We also have agency. So how do we make sense of the two? Well, dialectics might help us be able to think about how freedom and necessity are not necessarily in opposition to each other. How it'd be wrong to see everything mechanically, but it'd also be wrong to see everything as just kind of like, I'm just going to decide on, you know, random things, you know, that kind of stuff, right? From the dialectical standpoint, what true freedom is when I am acting according to my own like concept and I have knowledge of what I'm doing. Where the kind of like arbitrary notion of freedom would just be like, I'm just going to make random decisions. And, you know, here Spinoza says like the drunk believes themselves to be making free decisions too, but they're completely lost control, right? So that would be like a sense there of how one needs to understand opposites as not in unity, but in relation to each other. That the way that we are determined affects how we think, but then how we think informs our actions, which is then leads us to redetermine the world, which then redetermines ourselves, right? And so there is a movement from the world to how I'm thinking to how I'm acting to how I'm changing the world. That's then reconfiguring how I'm thinking, right? And so dialectic is about the movement between opposites, the transition of them into each other. Or the base and the superstructure can be thought of this way, right? So the base produces a superstructure, but how things are in the superstructure is not just, you know, this thing that just epiphenomenally just kind of mirrors whatever is absolutely determined here. Walter Rodney gives a really great example of the, you know, if your religion teaches you that certain trees are sacred, that's going to prevent you from cutting them down and thus affect the base, right? And so there's a dialectical or reciprocal relationship between base and superstructure.